Now, there's an important part of this process because we're going to begin with Greece, and I am Greek. And if you've seen the movie, yeah, that's my family. And I also know Vicki's family, which is Polish, and they're a whole lot like my family. And so we drink. And a while back, as we were talking about this program, I had pointed out to her that while I have had a variety of Polish drinks over the years, she really hadn't shared in a fine Greek drink a little bit of ouzo to get us going tonight. And people had asked, how do you know a good ouzo, other than the fact that afterwards you're not in that best shape, is that John Skokos, the head of the Department of Veterans Affairs, bought me this bottle of ouzo and brought it from Greece. But there's another trick for those of you who wonder if it's a good ouzo. Does it turn color when it's put on ice? It will. Notice. Oh, pour it. So, Vicki, to a fine evening together with our good friends.
To our great friends. Thank you. That's delicious.
Oh.
Take my seat.
And this way we'll be ready for those questions when they come.
We got half a bottle we can kill.
We can't kill a half a bottle.
Yes, we can. I'm not working tomorrow.
And do tell me if you can't hear us in the back, and I apologize, it's just the sheer size of the crowd. The theory behind what you're about to hear tonight is that we believed, both Vicki and I, that there's a real need for the conservative movement to understand the incredible historical premise that it shares. That is, not just in this country, but worldwide. And many of us assume that the other side has this incredible academic background. Untrue. It's particularly when we talk about freedom. 200 years ago, there was a process in America where they had what was called a Lyceum. Some of you may remember this from a rhetoric class. But a Lyceum is where Abraham Lincoln began. He began by, they would go to a community, and a group, not dissimilar to you this evening, would get together in an evening, and they would listen to speakers, usually two, who would speak about a particular topic, and then potentially debate that topic with the audience and otherwise. It's that Lyceum process that the beginning of the Republic, of our Republic, that was so important to educating the citizens. This is our attempt, Vicki and I, to begin to recreate that same sense that what we are a part of is a long history of conservative thought and a long history of constitutional democracy. I want to begin by stepping back in time. In the beginning, take yourself for a moment, you're in Greece. The year is 490 BC, September 21st. It's hot. You're just north of Athens. Against you on the other side, coming across the mountains and onto the plain of Marathon, is the largest military force ever arrayed in the history of the planet. King Darius, angry with what the Greeks had done in Asia Minor, is going to enslave the entire Greek population, just as he has done to all of Asia Minor. He has 30,000 of the best troops, most experienced troops in the world. He has the largest cavalry ever assembled, armored horses, 12-foot spears, archers who are the most advanced automation of the time, a weapon that people thought could not be beaten, as they rain arrows down on their opposition. And they had done that all from Asia Minor, near Jordan, the entire coast, and we're now 26 miles from Athens. Athens had 9,000 men. They were citizen soldiers. You and I, on the field, they had heavy armor, but they were strictly in infantry. No horses, no cavalry, no real armor. A sword about this long, arrayed against the greatest military force ever assembled. And on that day, September 21st, the free people of Athens, the free citizens of Athens, defeated Darius and the Persians on that field of battle. But it wasn't over, because many of you may remember the term marathon comes because Thelyceum, the largest naval force ever assembled, was also arrayed against the Greeks that day. And Athens, as you may know, sits in a small area with Piraeus as its port. And they brought the ships around. The Athenians assumed the people back, all there are, they're women and children. And the gates of Athens are open. Thelyceum runs 26 miles to the gates. And as his heart bursts, he says, "We have won on the field. Close the gates." And they do. And the Navy turns back. And Churchill called that the single most important day in the history of freedom. And he was right. Because had the Greeks lost on that day, the only democracy in history, the Athenian democracy, would have disappeared. It is hard to imagine, I think, for us today, what it was for them. This is the first time. So when we think today that, well, things look bleak, consider the Athenians. Consider what they did. And it's that democracy and how it started, the freedom and liberty that they had, that is what we're going to talk about this evening. In the Egyptian language, there wasn't even a term for freedom or liberty. In Mesopotamia and Persia, which is, by the way, Iran and the Middle East, the same areas we today seem arrayed against, freedom and liberty were defined as those rights granted by the absolute ruler. That was freedom or liberty in the context of the Persians. Not that it's dissimilar today, but that the absolute ruler could grant what they were. The army of Darius were slaves. They were told, you answer to the king, and only the king. And if he does not grant you this right, you don't have it. Against that, you had the Greeks, the Athenians. They had what we would call political or personal liberty. And Rufus Fears, an extraordinary professor who died shortly ago, he's a historian on freedom that both Vicki and I listen to regularly. He talked about it, that there is not a single civilization anywhere in the world that has not been touched by the Greeks, and that Greek culture that has found freedom or found liberty, as we understand that concept. So it was on that single day, all of the world changed. One of the problems that we as Americans have is that we come to accept, I think pretty much, that what we have as acceptable around the world. But that's simply not true. See if my computer works. What is freedom or liberty? Well, it's not universal. And if you leave with any other concept this evening, leave with that understanding that what we believe as freedom and liberty is not a universal aspiration or goal of people around the world. Indeed, it's not a universal aspiration today of people in this country. And the reason it's not, in part, is history, but in part is because many of us, we define it differently. by the way, just an interesting little sidelight, as I put on the slide here, is that we often use the term freedoms and liberty interchangeably, and we can have an academic debate about the difference. But in truth, there is no difference today, I don't think, in the language. Freedom is a Latin or Greek derivation, whereas liberty is a German derivation, and being a Germanic and Latin language, we've adopted both freedom and liberty. And using them interchangeably, I think, is the best way, and certainly both Vicki and I this evening are going to use them interchangeably. We won't try to make that very academic distinction. So what is freedom? So what did the Greeks mean? What did we mean? And if I went around this room, I think everybody here would start out with freedom. Well, that's individual freedom. That's what I have a right to do whatever I wish to do, as long as I don't harm somebody else. That's my individual freedom, or something to that effect. But that's simply not true. In fact, it's important to recognize that there are a lot of different definitions of freedom, and that when we use those terms, and the people you're dealing with at your church or in your community or here in the state, that they may see freedom very differently. And I've put up 6 different definitions of freedom, and I'm going to walk through them, because as I go through them, you'll see that, yeah, you recognize that is the way it could be. For example, when we talk about liberty or freedom, we often talk about national liberty. That's a freedom from foreign domination. When I taught in Russia, when they talk about freedom, they're almost always talking about national liberty, the ability not to be dominated by somebody else, our sense of who we are. There's the second one I've listed is political liberty. That's the freedom to govern ourselves. We have a right to choose those who govern us on a daily basis, whether it's on a local level, state level, national level. We take that for granted, that we have that right. But that's just one form of freedom or liberty. It's political freedom. It's political liberty. But think about the third, which Abraham Lincoln will address, and I'll get to that in a few minutes, but is equal liberty. That is freedom defined by the equality of citizens. That is that we are all equal, regardless of our status or stature. Now, if you think about that, and we take that one also, not only for granted, but we strive to reach it in this country, but think around the world, how little equal liberty really exists. Whether it's in England, where there are still classes, or in India, where there's unquestionably a class culture, and yet we would say India is free. India, in fact, elects its representatives, seems to have free speech. But they would not view equal liberty, that each of us is equally able or equally honored, as the same. That's a third type of freedom or liberty when we talk about the term. A fourth type is the type that I asserted at the beginning, one that I always believe in, which is the individual liberty or individual freedom, the right to do what I will, the right to do as one chooses. This is, of course, the libertarian position, one adopted, that we see today in Washington. I just came and watched Fox tonight, and it's always talking about the Tea Party as more libertarian. Whether it is or isn't, the concept is that you have individual liberty, that you have the right to freely choose to do what you would do. Then there's economic freedom, certainly rarely spoken about in ancient times, and that is the equal opportunity in a free market system. That, too, is a type of freedom or a type of liberty, economic freedom. And then the sixth of the ones that at least I've dealt with, is the freedom from want. Now, there's a curious one for those of us who grew up in a different age. We would have said freedom for want. We would have said, oh, Russia, communism. For some reason, that certainly doesn't have the tenor that it used to have. Having been to Russia, again, and having seen the collective farms now in disarray in eastern Russia, and have seen how the students there crave not to have freedom from want. It's a curiosity that we seem to have adopted it, but it's a type of freedom. So those are, that everything will be provided to you. So those are the 6 types of freedom that are generally accepted as, when we use the term liberty or freedom. But think about that. And think about it when you're speaking to someone, or someone is speaking to you, or a government official is talking to you. Which are they talking about? Which of these does it fall within? And that simple phrase that we like to say, we're all free in America. Well, what do you mean? What do you mean? It's not so simple. The concept, I'm going to hit that every time. Where does freedom come from? Where does freedom come from? Think of it, Darius, later Xerxes, in the Middle Eastern or Persian form. Wasn't it the same with him as it is with us? God-given? But he was the God. It was the God Xerxes. It was the Pharaoh who was the God. Is that any different, really, than the way we talk about it, where the rights are granted by a king? Note that the king, whether it's in Egypt or these others, always talks about the divine right of kings. Because they recognize that the mantle, as human beings, we recognize that the mantle of freedom comes from another source. It comes from our yearning. It comes from our God. So the king or the pharaoh becomes the God. And I'm the divine right of kings. So I'm the one who grants it. I'm God on earth. Would you be entitled to that freedom? It's a curiosity, as I said, that we always are very critical of these other forms, and yet how is that any less divine? We'll get to that in a moment. So after the Greeks, and there was a discussion of all of these forms of freedom in Plato's Republic and in other texts of the era, the next great happening, of course, was in about 146 BC, when Rome took over. So the great transfer of power from the Greeks to the Romans. Little sidelight for those of us who are Greek, we remember this. All of the best Romans spoke Greek. The Bible, much of it was written in Greek. I don't mean to make a big deal about this, but I am Greek. In Roman times, we have a change, and I wanted to isolate. We talked about the 6 forms of freedom, how the free people, because they were free, were able to defeat the immense power of another nation for the first time. But that was a pure democracy. So that in ancient Greek times, it was everybody, literally, all of the citizens would vote. And they would vote on everything. And that was the way in which the Athenian city-state could govern itself. How could that happen? Well, it's a city-state. Many of them were fairly small. So just like Waunakee or another town, they would all get together. The public officials in Greece, as they were in Rome in 146 BC, all of the officials of the government were citizens, you and I. It was expected that you would take the government post for a year or two. You would be paid, by the way, just like any other government official, and then you would return to private life. That was a true and pure democracy. And when we talk about complexity, I always get a kick out of this one. People say, well, it wasn't very complex back then. It was, this small place. Rome stretched from the Tiber River to Spain. So it was not true that it was not complex. In fact, it was one of the most complex of societies. They had hot and cold running water. They had sewers. They ran the Olympics. They ran commerce everywhere in the world. And ordinary citizens at the beginning of that republic were expected in 146 BC, just as they had been in Greece, in the city-states, to participate in government. And they did, and then they returned to private life. But of course, what happened as it grew was that it became difficult or impossible on some level to govern. So the Roman Republic, unlike the Greek democracy, elected senators. So they had a Senate. In our term, Senate comes from the same place. And our founding fathers looked at what had happened in Rome. That's how they built our government. It's actually an absolutely fascinating study to see how two governments were not identical, but very, very similar. And so when the Romans created their republic in about 146, they had these senators. And just like today, what happened in the next 100 years was that money talked. You had 300 senators. Everybody wanted their ear. More and more money. More and more corruption. So, in about 60 BC, Julius Caesar came along. And what happened? He declared himself Caesar for life, the ruler forever. And he said, in the classic sense, we are going to be a free society. We will have liberty and freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of commerce, Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. Jesus Christ is born during that time period, and he's able to spread a religion because you could. There was that freedom. They exchanged that freedom for the power of a monarchy. So it was the monarchy of Caesar, Caesar Augustus, and then the later Caesars, who protected that. And there's great texts written from that time period and after about how that worked. Because the democracy, the republic, had become so corrupt, it was important to have a single person in charge. And the people of that republic granted Caesar, willingly granted Caesar and his successors, the power to rule all of Rome. They still have some representation, but in the end, all power, all rights granted, would come from the imperium, from the Caesar. And I always find it interesting, too, I put it on the slide, that the word Tsar is simply Caesar in Russian. The word Kaiser in German is simply Caesar in German. They are derived from the term Caesar. They understood it. Curious, isn't it, that in 2008, the first thing the present president did was to appoint czars without embarrassment for using that term. It means what it means. It says what it says. And that's what Julius Caesar and his successors taught us. So you now have a republic and a pure democracy. But what happened? Well, with the monarchy, let me contrast two things. After that battle by Darius and Xerxes, Pericles becomes the ruler of Athens. He's elected by the people. The great golden age of Greece takes place. Freedom. Develop the greatest literature, the greatest art. Go there today and see the beauty of the statues. They're astounding. Go to the Olympic site in the Peloponnese, and you see these buildings that are truly astounding. As I said, they have running water. In 400 BC, Rome comes along after Caesars have taken over. And of course, we all know of the fall of Rome, that its literature dropped off, that its science dropped off. And by 300 AD, or thereabouts, they too are overtaken. And we have 1,000 years of darkness, 1,000 years in which monarchies control the world. Because Caesar said it was a good idea, because Caesar said it is better to have a single ruler who grants those rights. But look at the result. Compare the end of Rome to the greatness of Greece and what happened during that time period. And that will be repeated later in history. So it's interesting just to contrast and compare what freedom means and what true freedom, that is, all of the freedoms that we associated, including ruling ourselves, can do. So, what happens? We have 1,000 years of darkness, and until June of 1215. June of 1215 is Runnymede. Now, we, again, not taught here in our American schools much anymore, but the Magna Carta, the Great Charter, is signed by King John in June of 1215. This is the first time that there is a break during that 1,000 years of history, in which it wasn't perfect, but the people had revolted several times, actually, that led up to the 1215 signing of the Magna Carta, and the king agrees that they will have certain rights and that certain rules of law will apply to the king. So the king now acknowledges, no matter how many rights he grants, he too is subject to the control of the people. He is not completely able to do it. And I found it interesting, and I did go back and look at this, because that was my recollection of the Magna Carta. All of our Western law, the law that I practice, came originally from the Magna Carta. This is actually one of the translations of one of the articles of the Magna Carta, and I always find it very interesting. No free man shall be taken or imprisoned, or be diseased, that means taken away, of his freehold or liberties, or be outlawed or exiled. Nor will we not pass upon him nor condemn him, but by lawful judgment of his peers, or by the law of the land. We will not deny or defer to any man either justice or right. That provision of the Magna Carta remains law in England today. And it summarizes the first time since ancient Greece and the early Roman Empire in which due process of law is guaranteed to all of the citizens. Under certain circumstances, sure. And there'll be 300 more years before we have a good example of that begin in the colonies in the United States. And there'll be a lot of fighting, there'll be a lot of things go back and forth. But if you talk about freedom, and you talk about the great events of freedom, it begins on the Battle of Marathon, and it continues and is resurrected on the fields of Runnymede in the signing of the Magna Carta. So then what happens? Well, we all know our history and the founding of this country. And we often talk about it in different ways. And I want to be careful because there are many different interpretations of what then occurs in the United States. But there's a couple of things we can accept. That by the time that this republic is founded, there is no other place on the planet that has adopted a republican form of government. There is no example by which it is done. And I digress. There's an old Aesop's fable. It's the fable of the crow and the water. In the fable of the crow and the water, the crow finds a jar. It's a tall jar, and there's water in the jar, and he needs the water. And so he hobbles over to it, puts his beak down, he can't reach the water. He tries to tip it over, it's too heavy. He can't do it. Give up? No. The crow walks over, picks up the pebbles, drops the pebbles in the jar until the water rises high enough that he can drink the water. As in Aesop's fables, simply because a problem has not been solved before doesn't mean it can't be solved. It doesn't mean it can't be solved. You must think outside the box. You must think of new and different ways to approach that problem. You can read it as that crow in Aesop's fables. And that's what our founding fathers did. Because when they came here, they faced a whole new set of problems. Not simply the natives of the country, survival through winter, but they came here believing they would have freedom. And when it was taken away, they did not know what to do. No one had done it before, they thought. And so they looked to the historical precedent of Greece and Rome and the Magna Carta. And you're going to see all three of those in one of the greatest documents ever written, period, in any language. And that is our Declaration of Independence. We all know the story. We know that they wanted to remain part of this. We also know in history that it was a very small, relatively speaking, percentage of Americans who were willing to sacrifice everything for that freedom that they wished. We all look at the document from time to time, and we all hear it quoted, but it's helped sometimes to read it start to finish. When I was, again, teaching, whenever I have taught, I have always said I wanted my students to bring 3 documents with them. I want you to, if you're teaching any law class, I want you to bring the Declaration of Independence, the United States Constitution, and the Gettysburg Address. If you have those 3 documents, you have everything you need to understand what this country is about. Look at the Declaration of Independence carefully. Of course, we all begin with the great phrase, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We memorize that. We know that. We hear that. But let's break it apart. By their Creator. It's the natural law. It's not granted by a monarch. It's not granted by someone here on earth. It's granted by our Creator. And they said that. And so in the next phrase it says, and that to secure these rights, it's talking about the rights that the Creator gave them. The rights that no one could take away from a human. And as I said, if you look back even at the ancient pharaohs and kings, they too understood it, didn't they? Because they needed the divine right of kings in order to do what they did. That's the mantle they had to have. They understood it. And our founders understood that. So when they said these rights, they meant those of the creators, of our Creator. And the next phrase that is so critical is they deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. We acknowledge the Creator. We acknowledge the government is strictly there to protect those rights the Creator has granted. And then we acknowledge that the people must support those rights. And that the people, and only the people, can grant the government those rights. No one else can. And no one can take that away from you. And that's the Declaration of Independence. That's why it was so important. Because it called back to solve a problem that no one thought could be solved. And they pledged their lives to make sure that it would. So, with that, with the founding of this great republic, all the turbulence and all the problems, the next greatest event, and the last that I'm going to talk about before turning this over to Vicki. I better have a drink. I'm sorry. Is, I think, and I'm going to tell another brief story, is when I taught in Eastern Russia, in Siberia, and these kids, this is after the fall, and they crave freedom in Russia. Crave it. You get those kids in a room, and all they want is the freedom, the ability to go out and fail or succeed on their own. And I asked them before I left this country, what do you want me to talk about? And they wanted me to talk about discrimination. They wanted to talk about slavery. Now think about this for a minute. You have heard nothing for 50 years in your country but how horrible the United States is. How everything is discrimination. that there is no equality. And so I took that to create a lesson where I taught for 8 hours, 2 to 4 hour sessions, about nothing but the Gettysburg Address and our Civil War. And I mention that because it's the founding modern principle. It's the recreation of our founding fathers. When he said 407 years ago, he understood. He was calling us back to our beginning, to the beginning of the Republic, because that's when the problem was solved. The problem had already been solved. He simply needed to go back to get it again. And so when one looks at the Gettysburg Address, you see one of, again, like the Declaration of Independence, one of the most perfect documents ever written in English or any other language. And it is, of course, translated into every language. I had the great pleasure of traveling to Japan and Korea back in the 80s on behalf of the state government of Illinois. And it was remarkable how many Japanese officials of the government wanted to talk about Abraham Lincoln, that he was that revered in Japan, and we didn't appreciate him. And it was great because I was from Illinois, so we would give them little pins from Springfield, and they just loved it. Those guys, cheese they weren't interested in, but it was interesting to me because we could recreate that again when we went to Russia. They don't know. Here's how they ended the class. When we finished the Lincoln, and we usually all the faculty of the law school would come and listen to these lectures, and the students. And at the end of the Lincoln lectures, twice I delivered them, I got a standing ovation from everybody there. Afterwards, I'm sitting down with the faculty over vodka. It's Russian. And one of them says, "Well, Lenin is our Lincoln." I decided the better part of discretion was for me not to go on with that question at the time. But in fact, there's that sort of reverence for Lenin, a mythology that far outstrips what he did or didn't do. So I wanted to again come back to what we do not wish to acknowledge very much, which is that central to the Gettysburg Address, and again, I usually spoke for 8 hours about the Gettysburg Address, but central to the Gettysburg Address is some phrases later in the text, where he says that we here are highly resolved that these dead shall not have died in vain. By the way, that is a direct quote from Pericles' funeral oration following the wars I talked about. And it says, shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So his emphasis, again, never forgetting that our rights derive not from Abraham Lincoln, and not from the document. They derive from our Creator, and they are inalienable. That's so critical for us to remember. And by the way, the last phrase acknowledges, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth, that it can perish from the earth. He's praying that it will not. What we have is fragile. He's acknowledging that. He's acknowledging that, in fact, if we don't take it, if we don't take charge, it will disappear, even as he's honoring the results of the Civil War. So finally, let's come to what is freedom to us. It's divinely given. It's never from the government. It's always from the government. We are the protectors of it, never the government. That's been acknowledged for 3,000 years. It's always premised on individual rights of each person and the responsibilities of each person. And I want you to recall that I gave 6 separate definitions of freedom, national freedom and the like. 5 of those I've talked about. 5 of them are enshrined in all of the various items. We've done 5 of them. 1 is not. And that's the freedom from want. It appears nowhere. There is no historical precedent for it. It didn't exist in Greece. It didn't exist in Rome. It didn't exist on the field of Waunakee. It didn't exist at the time of the founding of the Republic. No one has said you have freedom from want. And yet, when we talk about freedom, how often today is that what we're talking about? How often is that what the opposition is talking about? The one thing for which there is no historical precedent. And we find that out as we turn into the 20th century. Vicki spent her life, her recent life at least, discussing that on the air. What does it mean? How hard is it? Can we keep it? What are the threats to this great democracy? Can we maintain freedom? Was Lincoln's prediction that we might lose it a possibility? And so it's really a great pleasure. Oh, I need to say something. I talked about Greeks. Vicki is Polish. And like Thelyceum, and what the Poles did to free all of Russia, let none of us forget. And the great contribution of the Polish people to modern freedom. And with that, Vicki, welcome.
That was phenomenal.